Right about now, we'll be introducing to you a start of our show.
I don't go around necessarily saying to people I'm a black filmmaker, but if I arrive at a screening or I arrive someplace, clearly who I am as a person of African descent is forefront.
The main problem with that sort of designation is that it assumes that as a quote-unquote black filmmaker that the only films you'd want to make would be black films or films dealing with black issues.
I wanted to know more about me, and so hey, you could call that ego, but me in a larger sense of being a black person in the world, a black Caribbean person in Canada.
For so long, other people represented us, you see? And now I think that we have a chance to represent ourselves to the world.
I'm like that, so keep my format black. I'm like that, so keep my format.
I have called myself a black filmmaker in the past. I consider myself a black filmmaker, but I will not call myself a black filmmaker anymore. And that is just because when you're dealing with the mainstream industry, which is the industry that I want to access, it's a really loaded title.
The black community is not one monolithic group, so it's not for me to put a label on myself.
Well, everything you do is related to who you are and your history. And my history is a black history, so I am a black filmmaker. I don't make a fuss about it, but I'm a black filmmaker.
I'm like that, so keep my format black. I'm like that, so keep my format. Like that, keep my format. It's like that, so keep my format.
You look like you have too much money. They might say,
my shoes to prove that I don't.
You can always tell a poor girl from nigga about their shoes.
Guys? Mm-hmm. I'm ready for you.
Ready for us?
Where's Damon?
Where's Damon?
He's coming. Okay, they're ready for us, they say. See the guys leave me to do all the work?
all right, have fun.
All right. How you doing?
John Grierson made a deal with the Hollywood studios, which will live in infamy because what it did was it meant that Canadians didn't make feature films. We made documentaries. The deal was that as long as we didn't venture into their turf and make feature films which would compete with Hollywood, we would be allowed to make all the documentaries we wanted, and the Hollywood studios would come up to Canada every now and then and make a movie with some Mounties in it.
Bigging up the dreaded fist from the Northwest.
Bill Greaves is an interesting and ironic note at the beginning of African-Canadian cinema. He couldn't get the kind of work and the kind of training that he wanted to in the States, and he was looking for something new.
The idea of a black person getting into the communications media was something that was a complete farce to them. It tells you the kind of social environment that America was in 1952. So, but I said to hell with them. You know, I said I'm going to become a filmmaker. You know, so I went up to Canada and I hung around the film board because I had been accepted as an apprentice, but they didn't take me on staff. So my problem was, how was I going to survive? You know, I mean, here I left behind me this career on Broadway and in motion pictures to become a filmmaker, and I, you know, didn't have a job.
And the Film Board at the time was training filmmakers from all over the world. It was a real hotbed of creativity, of work, of exchange of ideas, particularly in the short documentary and in animation.
I used to live on sugar and water. In these restaurants, I go and sit down in the restaurant and have a cube or two of sugar and some water, and then I would leave. I said, oh, I changed my mind. Tom Daly and them just sort of took pity on me, whether I looked very emaciated or something, but they took me on staff. We had some very talented people in Unit B, Colin Lowe and Wolf Koenig, a brilliant cameraman, and of course Norman McLaren. His work is legendary. He was a master, as was our good friend Terry Filgate, who was one of the leading lights of Unit B.
It's ironic that, you know, he ended up being the first black filmmaker to make films here, because then he left, and he was never Canadian to begin with. But, you know, what I think it shows you is the importance of the institution of the National Film Board.
They're going to want to see any changes that we make to Root in advance of us going in. They're not going to say, oh, we realize that there needs to be some repositioning, you know, therefore we'll do it in post. They're not going to buy that, I don't think.
But anyway, what are you guys prepared to do if they want to delay us?
I don't think they're going to cut us a check until they see another draft. That's my
Well,
thing.
they're not going to start the process.
Yeah.
So what are we going to say?
The first point is, do they have approval? Then we can talk about everything else.
The African American community was very upset over the fact that it had no access to the communications media in the country in a national sense. Black Journal was an attempt to address this particular grievance. I was asked to be a host. The revolution that was taking place throughout the country in the part of the black community found its way into the staff of Black Journal. And because all of the people, the black talent on the staff were all assistant directors and assistant editors and there's an assistant there, apprentices and things of that kind. But the producers and the directors were white, and white Americans were very good at, during that time, so there's nobody qualified for the simple reason that no one was allowed to learn any of this, this technology and so on, except that I had the very good fortune of having been in Canada working on over 80 productions on the staff of the National Film Board as an assistant director, as a director, as an editor, a sound editor, assistant editor, writer, and so on. It was inevitable that I would be selected as the executive producer, which I was, and from that point on, I promoted everybody.
William Greaves was the person who basically set the tone as executive producer, and he gave us 3 rules, which I've never forgotten. 1, you had to define the black reality. 2, you should show the causes of the black reality. And most important, you should suggest some kind of alternative or solution.
There was even a kind of a gap between Bill Greaves and what really became the start of African-Canadian filmmaking in the 70s.
I came to Canada officially in 1970. Before that, I was living in Trinidad. I was involved in the theater. I was involved very heavily in the theater as a director and working with scripts and stuff. And I always had an interest in the movies. I mean, there was a little cinema downtown called the Roxy, and it only did art movies. And I used to go there every chance I got. Looked at a lot of European movies, Antonioni, the British. There was a lot of British movies at the time, French movies, that kind of a thing. And somewhere along the line, I thought, you know, I'm going to make films.
I thought that in a small country, I come from Trinidad, that we could do a lot of stuff with people in the countryside pretty cheaply if we could bring television somehow into the classroom, or to bring more educational, in quote, kinds of things onto the television screens.
And that strength of culture coming to a city like Toronto, picking up also on what was going on in the States with the Black Power movement and the Panthers and Baraka and all of that kind of strength of culture that was coming out of the Black Power movement in the late 60s and early 70s, and trying to produce something local here. And so you have people like Claire Prieto and Roger McTair making the film Some Black Women.
We made that by taxi. We'd paddle the equipment in the taxi and go to run off to a location and then call a taxi and take it back to Ryerson.
The second film I think we did was called It's Not an Illness. It's a film about pregnancy and fitness. And we started that film with, well, the night before, next to no money, but then about $7,000 of independent money from, black community investors. Because that's something else that I wanted to prove, that black people would put money into film.
These were not films that were made with big assistance from the National Film Board or from the CBC. They might have been student films or films made with just very, very little money on low budgets, and films that were very close to the hearts of the filmmakers.
The toughest challenge was always money. How do you convince people to give you some money? How do you get the money to finish the film? Don Haig, who at the time was running Film Arts on Church Street, Don did an incredible job for us. I mean, we could always go to Don and say, listen, Don, we're shooting this film, we have no money. What can you give us? And he would either make calls for us, or if he didn't make calls for us, he would, he gave us a lot of editing time. I spent a lot of time editing at Film Arts.
He allowed a lot of filmmakers to get films made that would not ordinarily have been completed.
When we did Home to Buxton, for instance, we took it to the film board, and they said there was no story there.
We approached the NFB many times for stuff. It just was not a working thing. We got some PAFs money, on a couple of projects, but that was the limitation.
We're doing 3 different storylines, they're going to be shot in 3 different ways, then you have to have something that connects them. And Rude has to connect them more solidly, otherwise it's going to be this, you know, these disparate things.